We're going to go to the first panel. I think we're 10 minutes behind the specific schedule, so I'm going to assume, unless somebody tells me that I'm managing this to 10 minutes later, I'm aiming to end this panel at 15:55. I believe in time management. It's just one of the things that I was taught as a kid, so I will stick to it. We've got a great panel, and I'll introduce them in a minute. I just want to say a few words up front about, well, first of all, I want to say, great pleasure to be organizing this panel jointly with Adani Renewables and the Science Museum. Adani Green, Adani Renewables have recently become members of the Energy Transition Commission, and we are looking forward to working very closely with them and other members of the Adani Group, which covers lots of incredibly important industries, including, for instance, cement, to try and work out all the ways that we can get to a net zero economy. The most important bit of getting to a net zero economy, not the only thing, but the most important bit, is clean electrification. And before turning to the panel, I just want to make a couple of comments about why clean electrification is the single most important thing. And it's important because it is, by combination, the route to decarbonization, energy efficiency, and lower cost. It's the bit of the energy transition which is capable of being a win-win-win. It's a route to decarbonization because we now know how to produce electricity with no CO2 emissions, and those ways of producing electricity with no CO2 emissions are getting cheaper and cheaper. The cost of solar PV has come down 95% in the last 15 years. The cost of batteries has come down 95% in the last 15 years. And so you can put solar and batteries together now, and you can deliver continuous electricity at a lower cost in many parts of the world than fossil fuels. So we have the ability to decarbonize electricity at a low cost in a way that we didn't 20, 30 years ago. And with that green electricity, we should electrify as much of the economy as possible. Mr. Sagar Adani, who just spoke, said we should electrify everything. I think everything we possibly can. I think there's a few I'm not sure we know how to electrify, but I think in the long term, we will electrify far more of the economy than we now think. As we electrify, we get a whole load of benefits. Electricity is the wonder technology. It is silent. It produces no pollution at the point of use, unlike our other energy sources. If out there every single vehicle on the road were electric, you would actually get an appreciable reduction on the temperature of the street, because every one of those non-electric vehicles out there is turning 75% of all its energy, not into kinetic energy in the wheels, but into heat. So in terms of local pollution effects, it's hugely beneficial. It is also, however, hugely energy efficient. At the moment, in a fossil fuel-dominated system, we use about 170,000 terawatt hours of what we call primary energy: oil, coal, gas. But we turn that into 125,000 terawatt hours of what we call final energy: electricity, diesel, petrol, because a third of the energy in that coal, oil, and gas disappears in heat losses at power stations and in refineries before we get to the point where we use it. But we actually only get about 60,000 terawatt hours of useful energy, because you have no use for a litre of diesel. You can't consume it. You can't get enjoyment out of it. What you want is kinetic energy in the wheels of your car. But by the time it gets to the kinetic energy in the wheels of the car, 75% has disappeared in heat. So useful energy, which is what we want in the current system, is only about a third of primary energy. By electrification, we fundamentally change that. EVs turn 90% of the energy in the battery into kinetic energy in the wheels. Internal combustion engines only turn 25%. They're fundamentally more efficient. The most efficient gas boiler will only put 0.9 of a kilowatt hour of heat into your home for every kilowatt hour of chemical energy in the gas. It won't go above 90% efficiency, but a heat pump, by sucking heat out of the external atmosphere, can put 4 kilowatt hours of heat within your home for every kilowatt hour of electricity that you input. And that means that we can have lower cost of operation of EVs, of heat pumps versus gas boilers, and a cost benefit to the consumer. But increasingly, it's a cost benefit even in upfront equipment. Across the world now, we're going to the point where EVs are cheaper to buy up front than internal combustion engines. And that's inevitable because they're much simpler things to make. They have far less moving parts. And indeed, in general, everything to do with electrification and the production of electricity, everything to do with the manipulation of photons, ions, electrons, is falling faster than everything to do with the manipulation of molecules, with physics, as it were, is driving costs faster than chemicals, and that is going to go on and on and on. So clean electrification is the core of what we want to do. There is a hierarchy of what we should be electrifying. We should be electrifying vehicles, passenger road transport, freight road transport, residential heat, commercial heat, low temperature industrial heat, but also increasingly, and I know Arun is going to talk about this, we can increasingly expand it into high temperature industrial heat as well. And so maybe we will get pretty close to what Sagar said earlier, electrify everything. I will stick to electrify everything you possibly can, but at the ETC, we think electricity is going to go from 30,000 terawatt hours globally today to something like 100,000 by the end of the century. We are entering a new period of industrial revolution, and it is based on electricity. So that's why we want to electrify, but I now want to introduce a panel who are going to talk about, well, how do we do it? What's stopping us doing it faster? What are the specific challenges en route? And we have three great panelists: Greg Jackson, founder and CEO of Octopus Energy. And I suspect there isn't a person in the room who doesn't know about Octopus Energy. And if you don't know about it, you will by the time Greg has spoken about it. Alice Williams from Schnieder Electric, Digital Energy. Schnieder Electric, oh, by the way, we have three members of the ETC here: Octopus, Schnieder Electric, and Adani Green. Schnieder Electric, a leader in all the technologies to do with the management of buildings, the management of industrial processes, the management of electricity in particular in an efficient fashion. And finally, Arun Sharma, who is the advisor to the chairman of Adani Group, Group Head of Sustainability and Climate Change. So, with that, I'm going to turn over to you, Greg, to start us off on, from your perspective, what's getting in the way of us driving electrification as fast as we want to drive it, and how ambitious should we be?
First of all, thank you so much for that overview. It's really hard speaking after Adair, because he literally knows everything, and then summarizes it unbelievably compellingly. But so I'm going to start with a story, actually. My first job, I left school at 16 to write video games. I was a really good technologist. At some point, I ended up going to university and then working for a large company called Procter & Gamble. When I was at Procter & Gamble in the mid-1990s, my boss came to me one day and said, "You know about technology. Do you fancy running our website?" And now, I'd used the internet when I was at university in 1992, and I can tell you, it didn't look like the future. I said, "It's rubbish." I said, "It takes ages for a page. This is not going to work." Right? So I turned down the chance to run the website because I knew too much about technology. What I didn't know about was exponential growth. And if you ever want to know why there are a bunch of companies that created the greatest value in the world ever around the time of the internet boom, it's because there were some entrepreneurs that understood exponential growth, and they saw the capabilities of computing, communication, and usage numbers, and they just extrapolated the exponential growth, and they got in while everybody else rejected it. That lesson has stuck with me forever, and when I look at the technologies of electrification, they follow the same curve. Adair mentioned the plummeting costs in batteries, solar. By the way, similar shape curve, different numbers, but for wind. But for electric vehicles, for electrification of heat, they all follow these curves. And when you bring these curves together, i.e. the ability to generate electricity ever cheaper, exponentially cheaper, and the ability to use it with equipment that's following the same curves, and by the way, optimize it with computing that's following the same curves, the very mature world of fossil fuels can never catch up, right? The genie's out the bag. So the first thing I'd say is that in today's world, a fossil fuel economy and an electrified economy probably have roughly the same kind of outcomes. But give it 5 or 10 years, because the exponential growth is not stopping, right? That's the point, all right? So give it 5 or 10 years. Countries that do not recognize the opportunity of electrification are going to increasingly look medieval. They'll still be burning stuff while others have got astonishing clean streets, clean industry, and lower cost of production and of living than ever. That's part number one. I started to tell a couple of stories because I learned a lot from that internet revolution. The other industry that I'd love to look at is music streaming. You will all remember when the only way you could stream music was illegally. Now, it was convenient, it was free, but that wasn't the reason most of us did it. We did it because it gave us access to an incredible range, very conveniently, on a whole slew of devices that were becoming available. And the music industry's reaction was not to recognize that their business was actually finding, signing, protecting the IP, and promoting artists. They thought their industry was selling bits of plastic that contained music. And so they literally helped lobby for laws that would send their customers to prison rather than working out how to adopt these new technologies for their industry. Eventually, the dam broke. Technology always wins in the end. And today, the music industry makes more money from streaming and from the services such as concerts. We've never had billion-dollar concerts before. You now have billion-dollar tours. All of that kind of innovation occurred after 15 years of resistance from the industry. So, Adair, you said, what is holding us back? The music industry is pathetically weak compared to the fossil fuel industry. And I'm not being a conspiracy theorist about it. The fossil fuel industry, they literally have governments will send armies to defend their businesses. Anytime I go into a room with politicians, there'll be half a dozen people there from that industry. I'm not saying they're evil, and I'm not saying they're cynical. But like the music industry, currently they see their business as, for example, selling energy in a certain package, not as providing the means to, for example, get from one place to another or to heat or cool a building. As a result, they are so resistant to the change we need. And just like I didn't understand the internet because I saw it too soon, BP first started being beyond petroleum in the 1990s. The technology wasn't there. Anybody I speak to in that industry tells me why the technology of today won't work, because they've missed the impact of that exponential change. So both their self-interest and their lack of understanding mean that the most powerful lobbying force in the world is holding us back. But if you want to see the real opportunities, honestly, I'm not naive about it, but you see it in China in particular. I was there a couple of weeks ago. Every single two-wheeled vehicle is electric. They're silent. There's no pollution. Every taxi, every bus, in most cities, probably half the cars on the road, in some 70%. Vans, even trucks. I was with the biggest maker of batteries in the world, and I said to him, in the UK and Europe, only 1 or 2% of the trucks being sold are electric. In China, it's 25%. He said, no, Greg, that was last year. Now it's 37%. So they're not looking at a whole load of curves that say, here are the sacrifices we have to make to go clean. They are beginning to build an electrical economy and powering increasing from renewables. So we all know about Chinese coal, but now 70-odd% of all renewables being built in the world are being built in China. Right? And they're not just doing it because they're nice people, they may or may not be. They're doing it because it gives them energy security, energy independence, and of course, by the way, tackles climate change. And so I think my closing thought on what's holding us back is every time Adair or I talk about the way in which electrification can slash costs for industries and for consumers, there's a whole load of people who sell energy or who are the politicians representing towns that currently provide energy who see falling costs as a huge threat. And we're not looking enough at the consumer and the businesser that will benefit enormously from falling costs of energy. But unless we learn to look at the demand side rather than the supply side, we risk missing the boat. So I would say to us, let's not, look, we will continue to need fossil fuels for a while, but we need to be really clear. Fossil fuels are the tobacco industry. In decline, it still generates great returns, but we've moved on. And we now, in the advanced economies of the West, need to do the same.
Great, Greg. Thanks very much. Greg, listening to you talking about failure to understand exponential curves, I failed to understand them, and my fellow committee members failed to understand them when we produced our first report at the Climate Change Committee in 2008, because I was the first chair of the UK Climate Change Committee, and we tried to think about what was going to happen to the costs of different technologies, and we were very proud of our careful analysis, and so we tried to think what might happen to the cost of carbon capture and storage between, say, 2010 and 2025, and solar PV between 2010 and 2025. And after a great deal of deliberation, we thought that we knew solar PV would come down at quite a pace. We were very, very optimistic about it, and we put in a figure that it might come down by about 40%. And it came down 95%. We were so wrong that I rather hope people have destroyed all copies of our reports, because it just showed we did not understand exponential curves. If anybody has not looked at the figures, it's an interesting question I sometimes try. How much do you think the cost of solar PV has come down in the last 50 years? Many people will say 90%. Many will say 99%. Most people don't know that the correct answer is 99.9%. That the cost of solar panels per watt of power has come down 1,000 times in 50 years and will keep coming down for some reasons which we can't go into, but they are inherent to the nature of this technology. Meanwhile, we looked at CCS and we thought that that might come down by 25 or 30%, and it failed to come down at all. Basically, we have a set of technologies which are capable of being mass manufactured and standardized, which achieve cost reductions which are not achieved by things which are bespoke engineering and the manipulation of molecules. So, turn to you, Alice. You're leading Schnieder Electric's digital energy business here in UK and Ireland, and you're actually working with customers, their buildings, working out what are decarbonisation options. I mean, how optimistic are you at the pace at which we're moving, and what do we need to do to go faster?
Thank you. So the first thing I'd say is I'm an optimist and a bit mischievous with my view on things at the minute, because I think we have a moment in time, particularly in terms of how the demand market is working, where, if we're very honest, this room is the choir, right? So we all believe in decarbonisation and sustainability, and that's why we show up to events like this, and it's why we do London Climate Action Week. But the reality is, not everybody is the choir, and capital talks, and the economy talks, and profits talk. And so for a long while, where we would see a little bit of that friction, a little bit of that slowdown, was, are people willing to spend the capital to do it just because it's clean? Now, the really fun thing about this moment in time is this has become a question of affordability, and frankly, accessibility to power. And I'm speaking particularly from commercial building side of things. Greg's organization really helps support residential. I'm on the commercial building side of things, but that is commercial real estate, that is hospitals, that is education centers, that is data centers. And at this inflection point in time when we're talking about energy security and energy resilience, we also need to power data centers that are going to consume double the terawatts by 2030 that they currently do. And so we start to see energy and ultimately access to efficient, which electricity is, and agile, which electricity is, being a real mandate just to continue doing your business. So if we're going to build data centers, how am I going to maintain access to the power I need to power my hospital or my university or my building or actually my manufacturing plants, etc. in the UK? So as we see it accelerate in the real world, really one of the questions we have is, how do we do that in existing buildings as well? So we can quite often imagine these, certified, green, 100% electrified buildings of the future. But the reality is, and you look out the window and it's wonderful, what a wonderful view, by the way, most of our building stock is already here. Most of it already has maintenance backlogs. Most of it already has operations that need to continue running. And therefore, how do our industrial sites, you don't want to take your industrial site offline because you immediately lose profits the moment you do that. And so how do we electrify broadly a building stock that is already here, and how do we make that palatable? So that's the kind of challenge, and I guess the moment we're seeing at the minute. I am optimistic because the conversation has really started to move to performance, and our customers are realizing that this does not have to be the overnight transformation. So 100% electrification and full upscale of your manufacturing facility in Scarborough, for example, which we just did our own, so we've lived through the pain. That is a really big thing to wrap your head around when you're trying to do it all at once and when you're thinking about how do I run my P&L and how do I roll out my capital. But actually, Greg talked about, obviously, exponential gains. I think the compound effect within that is really, really important for businesses regards to electrification as well. So what we're starting to see is the appetite that says, hey, I can take one first step. And that might, for example, in an office building in London, look like occupancy sensors. Super simple technology, right? But the cheapest watt of electricity is still the one you don't waste, or any energy, to be fair. It's still the one you don't waste. So occupancy sensors, which in London we can demonstrate can leave you at a lower energy setting for 76% of your business operating time. You can reduce your bills by 22% just from the rollout of occupancy sensors, and the same in terms of your carbon emissions as well. And the payback period, even for very sophisticated versions of that, can be over 2 years. And so what I'm excited about, I guess, and we see in the market with our customers, is they're starting to understand that it's the same as a fitness journey, right? I do not have to go out and run the London Marathon, certainly not in this heat. I do not have to do that tomorrow. Tomorrow I have to get up, put my trainers on, tie them up and leave the door, and that's my first step that I can take. Similarly, we are starting to see this in industry. So we're starting to see people electrify industrial operations. Again, Schnieder, and hopefully you'll see that we got our accolade for #1 world's most sustainable company again, third year in a row. Just yesterday it was announced, but we're trying to walk our own talk. So we have our own manufacturing sites where we're going for electrification across our operations. Now, I know we're going to cover later, we don't have some of those high energy intensity, hard to abate sectors. But increasingly we're seeing customers see that as a pathway to competitiveness. Because again, what they know is that they get secure energy if they electrify, they get power quality, which they electrify, and that's really important, particularly in complex operations, where if you don't have the right power quality and you're modulated, and actually electricity is much better in terms of power quality, then all your harmonics are off, and you can just be shedding profit throughout your infrastructure without even realizing it. And so we're seeing quite simple steps that people are then getting the compound effect of. They're getting the savings for which they can share back to their boards, they can share back to their investors, and they can reinvest either in future projects, depending on their overall strategy and particularly what they're communicating, or they can give back to shareholders, which again is that really economic cycle of why would we bother investing in this. So I am very optimistic. I think the interesting thing for us to think about here is that ultimately this is about asset readiness. So again, we have huge potential in terms of clean, green energy coming onto the grid. The grid must be ready, and that is a whole nother ball game. But also individual assets must be ready, and a lot of that is about visibility, is about actually knowing what you have. If you ask a number of portfolio managers, they may be like, I got 4 buildings somewhere in the city, maybe. But it's actually about having visibility so you can take control of where your energy is, where you can save money, and you can actually optimize in the electricity that you do bring on board. So I'm a general optimist. As I say, I also recognize the game we're currently playing in, and if people aren't interested in investing in clean, they are interested in investing in saving money normally.
Great. Alice, thank you for focusing on some of the real world challenges when you're dealing with commercial buildings or industrial facilities, the assets that exist at the moment. And I think at the ETC, we're very aware of a sort of spectrum of difficulty on this electrification journey. And the easiest bit really is the passenger car. I mean, every now and then somebody buys a new car. Consumers are quite capable of working out what car they want, and they get rid of an old asset and they get a new asset, and that asset is increasingly definitively cheaper to buy and to run, and it's a better product. And we are very, very optimistic about how rapidly the electrification of passenger cars, but also increasingly freight, is going to go. But the moment you go to commercial buildings or to some of residential buildings with heat pumps, to industrial facilities, you've got a much more complicated thing, because you've got an existing asset. You're not just getting rid of one asset and buying another. It's not a nice, easy binary decision. You're struggling with lots of intermediate possibilities. And I think as we think forward, and there's going to be this target at COP31 about driving electrification across the world, helping countries think through the spectrum of difficulty and the different policies that are required for different sectors to drive electrification will be important. And that brings me to you, Arun, because Adani Group is driving the development of renewables, as we've heard earlier, but you are also, is it the biggest or the second biggest cement producer in India? In India through your purchase of Holcim. And I think you are at the cutting edge of some of the ideas about how we might extend electricity even to what we have previously thought of as very hard to electrify sectors of the economy.
Well, thank you, Adair. I think we had a commissioners' meeting of the Energy Transition Commission yesterday. And the discussion was about what can we do to keep closer to the Paris targets. So the biggest chunk is electrification. The next chunk is decarbonize electrification. And of course, then a small chunk is get the fossil fuel to become more efficient and eventually phase out. But an equally big chunk is how to address hard to electrify sectors. So this is something, and the best way to explain how we are doing it is perhaps to take the example of our cement business. Our manufacturing capacity is 109 million tons a year. That is more than the entire annual output of United States. And it turns out when we inorganically grew our cement business, it had a science-based target initiative of 2050, net zero. And the real question was whether we should stick with this target or not. Because in India, carbon capture and storage is not a viable option because sequestration reserves have not been characterized. You will have to capture the carbon dioxide, put it on a ship after liquefying it, and rent expensive space from Saudi Arabia. The economics doesn't work. But we said, and this is where the promoters of the company, Sagar, Karan Adani, who was looking after cement, they felt that if Adani Group cannot stick to the 2050 net zero target, who can? So the first thing they did was exactly what Adair said, order a gigawatt of captive renewables. Wherever the low-hanging fruit is, you are able to electrify. Then we started looking at innovation. So there are two sources in cement. One is the kiln where you burn coal. And the other is the calcination process where you produce clinker from calcium carbonate. Now, in the kiln, we need coal because electricity is not able to get us to high heat. We scouted around the world, and our cement team was able to identify a Finnish company called Coolbrook that has figured out how to use inert gases like nitrogen and air and keep rotating it to sonic boom and capturing that energy to produce heat. At COP last year, we announced not a pilot, but a small amount of the heating in the kiln in a full cement plant, which gives return on investment in a few years. So it was not only a full-scale implementation in the plant, but it had a business model. If this is successful cost effectively, which we believe it will be, then we will start trying other parts of the kiln, and this is electricity to high heat. Then we started focusing on the kiln. The problem in the kiln is that when you go through the calcination process, you are again using fossil fuels. And then what you get is flue gas, which is both from the combustion of fossil fuel and also the process emissions from the calcium carbonate. And if you want to capture the carbon dioxide, good luck, you're looking at $100 plus per ton. So what we now did is we partnered with an Australian company with a UK presence, Lilac, who have developed the technology and have done pilots in Europe on preheaters for the calcination process. So this one, we are now implementing the design phase in an existing cement plant where the preheater had to be replaced anyway. So we are using the Lilac technology, which will allow us to use electricity. And it will increase in clinker production, so that makes the business case more viable. But the beauty is that not only it opens the door for electrification of the calcination process, but the carbon dioxide that you get is a pure stream carbon dioxide. There is no cost of carbon capture. And that carbon dioxide, combined with green hydrogen, will give you cost-effective e-methanol, which can be exported to countries like Germany that have to figure out a way to decarbonize the chemical industry. When you look at the chemical industry, almost every part of the process, intermediate step is methanol. Right now that is being done from naphtha or natural gas. If we can produce industrial CO2, you might wonder that the carbon dioxide still coming from cement. But if you are making PVC or long-lived chemicals, you have effectively captured the carbon dioxide in there. So this is our pathway. Innovate with all these technologies. It is using green hydrogen and derivatives. And by the way, I believe that green molecules are electrification on steroids. You just need a lot more electricity upfront. And our plan is to try to have one net zero cement plant by 2035 and then replicate it in the next 15 years to meet that 2050 net zero target. So this is how we are trying to do that. But I have to acknowledge the promoters, their vision. Professional management will look at the next 3 or 4 years. They are here that this pledge will, they are young enough that by 2050, they will be there to answer for it. But this is a great opportunity where Adani Group is able to bring all the pieces together in the decarbonization journey.
Great.
Oh, thank you.
I think it's interesting to think about how much of all our emissions can we electrify away. Depending how you count methane on an equivalent basis, you can think about the world as producing about 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions. Of those, at least 30 come from the things that I think at some stage we will definitely electrify, which is road transport, residential and commercial space heating, and low to medium temperature industrial heat, up to say 400 degrees centigrade. Beyond that 30, there's 10, which we call this hard to electrify sector. And what is interesting is how far into that will we actually take electrification of that 10? And that makes me feel that clean electrification is certainly 60, 70% of everything we need to do to get to a zero carbon economy. It isn't everything. There's stuff to do with the food sector, but it's a lot. Now, I'd like to ask one question to Alice and Greg in particular, and then I will see whether there's a chance for maybe one question from the floor. I know there are a lot of expert people I can see from here, and some of you may want to ask a question. The question I want to ask you, Greg and Alice, is about not electricity, but peak electricity, right? Because we know that when you use a gas boiler, right, the cost of using the gas boiler is the same at, 7 o'clock in the evening on a winter night and at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's the cost of the gas. But it is the inherent feature of electricity and of the systems that we're building that electricity costs different amounts at different times of day. That's because of the intermittency of generation and the problems of balancing supply and demand. It is also crucially, and we don't often spend enough time about it, on the distribution grid and the transmission grid. I had lunch on Tuesday with, many of you may have met him this week, Hakan Yilmaz, who runs a big part of Carrier air conditioning business, and he was telling me, I think it's something like 25% of the peak load electricity in the US is everybody hitting on their air conditioners at the same time. They now have a major product where they are selling together a air conditioner and a battery as a joint product in order to make sure that you can run the air conditioner when you want, but not necessarily take electricity off the grid when you want. Could you both comment on just how big are these challenges and what are the mechanisms by which we're going to make sure that we don't, what I would say, electrify in a dumb way? The dumb way to electrify is to boost electricity demand and then have to build our grids to meet huge peaks and various forms of backup generation to meet huge peaks. And maybe talk about it from the residential point of view and talk about it from the commercial point of view. Yeah, Greg, far away.
I think this is one of the most important aspects. At the moment, our electricity is too expensive in the UK, across Europe, and in by way of some other countries. It costs maybe 5 or 10p a unit to generate electricity in the UK from renewable sources, but by the time it comes out your socket, it's 25p. So it's gone up to 5x, and then a big chunk of your bill is fixed costs on top of that. Our system is brutally inefficient. We need to fix that to get electricity costs down and to enable consumers and businesses to benefit from the genuine low cost at which we can generate electricity most of the time. If I break that into maybe 3-ish thoughts, Adair, you first of all mentioned the kind of the fact that electricity is not the same price all the time, unlike gas. So at the moment in the UK, the price of electricity varies on a typical day, the wholesale price, from maybe 3 pence a kilowatt hour to 35 pence, depending on the time of day. It varies every half hour. Quite often it goes negative. You literally get paid to take it. And sometimes it spikes to extraordinary levels. For example, yesterday it hit 85p at one point, I think. So the first thing is if you can grab more of the electricity at the cheap times, then you can power life more cheaply. This used to be impossible. But with smart meters, with huge amounts of data processing, and with devices like electric vehicles and thermal control, you've got huge flexibility when you use electricity. An electric vehicle owner doesn't care whether you charge their car at 6 p.m., midnight, or 4 a.m., as long as they've got enough to get to work in the morning. Octopus intelligently charges in the UK about 400,000 cars. That is, you literally just pair the car software with our software, and we squirt the electricity at the cheapest times. That collectively is 3 gigawatts of charging. If you don't know what a gigawatt is, the UK is a 50 gigawatt system, so it's already fairly significant. In fact, it's the same as, 2 or 3 nuclear reactors in scale. But cars, currently only 5 or 6% of cars are electric, and they're not all with us, sadly. But if you multiply it up, that's 120 gigawatts of cars in a 50 gigawatt system. That's where we're going. Inevitably, it's where we're going to end up. Right now, the UK is planning on spending 100 or 200 billion pounds on new grids and networks, largely to be able to accommodate electrification, largely of transport. But when you use the system intelligently, like I've just described, a household with an electric vehicle has 60% higher consumption, but only 4% higher peak. And it's the peak that matters, because if you exceed the peak, the grid melts. The point really being, you can accommodate an awful lot of electric cars with very little new infrastructure if you manage them intelligently. That also means they're 6 times cheaper to run than a petrol car. everyone wins. But right now, and I talked about incumbency earlier, the incumbent's not just the oil industry. The incumbent electricity industry is so conservative, so laggardly, and so fails to understand these changes. The planning framework for the UK is for every 100 percentage points to increase the amount of electricity consumption, they assume the peak will increase 70. That is so catastrophically wrong, and we're all going to pay for it. We could feel better. Europe's going to spend 1.2 trillion euros on new grid, and Germany's trying to build 20 gigawatts of gas plants to handle these issues. It is genuinely nuts and wasteful. Just a couple more facts then. I was with the CEO of one of the biggest car companies in Europe. He's struggling with the EV transition. He said he was sitting with the CEO of one of the biggest grids in Europe. And he said to the grid operator, like, how many EVs can you support on a street without new infrastructure? And the grid operator said, 3 or 4. And first of all, I just pointed out that's bollocks. Worse than that, pretty soon, most electric vehicles will be able to do what we call vehicle to grid. That is, they go both ways. A car with vehicle to grid has a negative peak consumption, i.e. it supports the grid at peak times. I.e. the more vehicle to grid cars you put on any part of the grid, the more of everything else you can have. It's not just EVs. A house with a heat pump only has 14% higher electricity consumption, 14% higher peak, because we can shift it. And aircon, even in Texas, we have customers that pair their air conditioning with us, and we don't put batteries in them, although that's great. What we do is we know when the peak electricity time is going to be, so we pre-chill the home, so it's just below your target temperature, and during the periods of peak electricity pricing, we'll let the temperature drift up a little bit. You won't get uncomfortably hot, but in return you save a lot of money because the electricity you're not using is the most expensive. So every part of the system, it reduces the cost because you're competing less for electrons at the times of peak demand. It reduces the amount of grid you need, which should reduce European energy costs by, expenditure by €1 trillion over the next sort of decade or two. If we did it, which currently we're not planning to do. But I think also crucially, it reduces the problem of intermittency. People always say energy incumbent thinking is, it's not always windy, it's not always sunny. Now, of course, that's genuinely a problem. But it ain't such a big problem if you turn that around and say when it is windy, when it is sunny, you've got astonishing amounts of zero marginal cost energy that we can use these days, reducing our demand at the rest of the time. So everything gets cheaper.
Great, very clear. And the scale of the potential benefit from what I call doing electrification cleverly, not dumbly, is really huge. Alice, from the commercial building point of view, and Schnieder Electric thinks about this a lot, and you have a lot of products that help people do this. Can you comment briefly on this challenge?
Yeah, I guess if you take big and certainly leading edge commercial buildings and campuses, the reality is they are already part of this flexible future energy system, right? So they have not just switched fuels. What they have done is integrated on-site generation, storage, EV, and their own flexible controls. The reality is at the minute they're not then stacking into an intelligent grid, but ultimately what we see is the overall energy infrastructure becoming more flexible, becoming much more variable in terms of where the demand is being generated and the storage is as well, and the microgrid and prosumer approach coming into play, particularly with some of the big infrastructure pieces. And that is really, really critical in terms of having an intelligent energy layer, because otherwise, again, what you can't do is have equity across economies. So, okay, big players who can afford to will invest in that, and they will have energy sovereignty in their own operations. But then when you bring it down to a city level, for example, all that does is actually take quality power away from, say, a school or an NHS trust that also needs access to high quality power, also wants to digitize their operations, incorporate AI, and has more power hungry needs. And so this is a criticality of the grid ultimately having a data spine. We talk quite a lot with policymakers about the importance of seeing digital infrastructure as core infrastructure. It's no longer negotiable. We look at funding for what we consider to be traditional, shovels in the ground type infrastructure, but ultimately you're adding more dumb systems onto something that requires intelligent. We very excitingly, Kraken, Octopus's technology arm, we announced a partnership with Kraken, again, to bring our minds together And that is really trying to focus on real-time grid visibility so that you can start to unlock demand across these flexible infrastructures at the macro layer as well, and that's very important. We're seeing it in some legislation now, the requirement to have digital, but we do also have a moment to do it where funding's been released. We're going to go through big phases of uplift in the grid. It will be cheaper for us to digitize it now than after the fact.
Arun, do you want to comment on this issue of flexibility, or should we take a question from the floor? What do you want to?
The flexibility at a different level.
Okay.
And this is actually, Sagar was referring to the proactivity of the Indian government in a regulatory way. I think sometimes when I'm talking at New York Climate Week or others, and I tell them that when we were building the world's largest renewable energy park, the transmission line connecting to one single national grid in India was ready before even a single electron was fired. They are just blown away. So I think the point that I want to make is that India has a big challenge, but the government has really taken proactive steps to help the business model to emerge from the private sector. So they have plans. Whenever land is allocated for renewables, the bidding for transmission line also happens at the same time. Can it happen faster? Yes. Can the states do more? Yes. But what happened is that when the transmission line is there and it is only catering to solar and wind, then it is not being used during non-solar hours. So their innovation was, okay, you only as an independent power provider have it for solar hours, we'll make it available to someone else. So the incentive for players like Adani is execute 3.3 gigawatt hours of battery in 9 months so you can actually sell merchant electricity in the evening to all the manufacturers in India that eventually are trying to avoid paying CBAM to Europe. So what is happening is we have to figure out, like, it is sustainability winter, but we have to figure out international regulatory framework, Indian regulatory framework, the private sector identifying business models to do this. And I always like to say that China has shown the way. The fact that we are even in the game to get to well below 2 degrees is because China has shown the economy can be electrified. But Chinese industrial policy has played a very important role. But China had the public finances to put huge amounts of money in industrial policy. The Chinese industrial policy was on steroids, whereas the Indian industrial policy is on Ozempic, because it doesn't have the level of finances. And that has led to better utilization of resources. And like Ozempic, there are further benefits to following that approach. So I think that's the answer from an Indian perspective.
No, and I think from the ETC point of view, we have become great admirers of some of the innovations that have occurred in India. The ability, for instance, to use the transmission network as a common carrier system, to simply say, I'm going to do a huge bit of renewables at the other end of India and then take the electricity notionally out at a different area and simply pay a charge, very easy. And also the round-the-clock renewables. The round-the-clock renewables contract has been a real innovation, which we talk about for the rest of the world. Look, I'm sorry, I've failed to control time. I am going to stick to time. We've done about 48 minutes on this one, but I think we've had a very good discussion of an issue which we could talk about for much longer, but I think we've got some idea of some of the challenges, but the enormous opportunities in electrify. Thank you very much to the whole of the panel.